Hey guys, it's Icarus here.
And Amelia.
And I'm here to tell you if you'd like to join our brand new adventure. Go to DevonTaylorAuthor.com to learn more.
And check out the cool items like the new bucket hat.
Yeah, and so much more. See you guys there.
Devon Taylor, Devon Taylor, Devon Taylor, Devon Taylor, Devon Taylor podcast. Hello all, and welcome back to another episode of the Devon Taylor podcast. You all know I love diving deep into conversations about transformation, healing, and personal growth. So today I am so happy to welcome another guest who embodies all of that and more. Dave Roberts is a man of wisdom and compassion. He is the co-author of When the Psychology Professor Met the Minister, a book that explores the intersection of grief, resilience, and spiritual discovery. He's also the host of the Teaching Journeys podcast, where he shares his powerful stories that inspire and uplift. I was lucky to be a guest on that podcast and looking forward to just keeping up with it. Dave's journey is rooted in both academia and personal experience, and his work offers a unique perspective on how we navigate loss, faith, and self-discovery. I'm excited to unpack his insights today. So Dave, let's start off with your story. What led you to explore the connection between psychology, spirituality, and healing?
Thank you, Devon. First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me to be a guest on your podcast. I've been looking forward to our conversation for a while. I so enjoyed our conversation for my own podcast, the Teaching Journeys podcast, and I was grateful to be given an invitation to share my story and what I've learned and how my story has continued to evolve. But let me give you some brief background. I did not always envision that I would be embracing the field of death, certainly not spirituality, and looking at how spirituality intersected with psychology. My career path started very predictably. I developed an interest in working with individuals with substance use disorder, and as a result, I was a substance use abuse counselor and a clinical supervisor for an inpatient facility in the state of New York for about 27 years. I retired in 2000, and prior to retirement, I'd begun to teach part-time in the psychology department at Utica University. And after retirement, my teaching expanded to the point now where I'm teaching anywhere from 3 to 4 courses at 2 different universities right now. So that has been my primary passion, is working with young adults, as well as doing bereavement support and helping individuals transcend challenge in person, and obviously through the podcast, and having individuals share what's gotten them through tough times or share life skills that can help other individuals with tough times. About 16 years into my tenure as an addiction professional in 2002, first of all, I backtrack a little bit. I am married. I've been married for 42 years. I have 3 beautiful children, 4 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren. So I've run the spectrum of categories as far as parenting and grandparenting and great-grandparenting. I have 3 children, 2 who are alive and 1 who is in spirit on the other side. And that's the focus of my story and how my path shifted very abruptly from the world of addiction and psychology to studying death, and then eventually integrating spiritual practices with my science-based background. In September of 2001, my then 17-year-old daughter, Janine, who was very much in love with the love of her life, came to my house. She called me and said, "Dad, we need to talk to you." That was me and her significant other. For her and her significant other, excuse me. Janine was about as subtle as a trumpet solo. And, she was very, very upfront. She came in the house, and before Devon, the door even shut, she looked at me and she said, "Dad, I'm pregnant." Okay. So I had a couple of different options when she told me the news. I could have been angry and said, what are you thinking? Why did you do what you did? But I didn't go there. I for a couple of different reasons. One, it would not have done any good to to improve the situation. And secondly, I really liked her boyfriend a lot because he was 18 years old, was mature beyond his years. I know he loved my daughter dearly, and I knew he was going to take care of her. So we just went through the options. Like we talked about, do you have a plan? And they said, yeah, we do have a plan. The only thing I said to Van is, I wish you would have waited a little longer until this happened, but let's just go with it. Let's see what we got. The one thing that Janine said, she goes, will you tell Mom? I said, no, I'm going to leave that one up to you, honey. That's something that you need to talk to her about directly. Her pregnancy appeared to be going on, very uneventfully. However, early in her pregnancy, she injured her right foot in a freak accident, and her foot continued to swell. And it didn't respond to any traditional treatments for a swollen foot. It didn't respond to a walking boot, elevation, rest. So finally, in April of 2022, the podiatrist said, we need to do an MRI. And she said, no, not till after my child is born. So on May 2nd, my first grandchild, Brianna, was born. Brianna is now 22, and she has two little girls of her own.
Wow.
Yeah, so they did an MRI. They found an undefined 8-centimeter mass at the bottom of her foot. They did a biopsy. Brianna was born May 2nd. They did the MRI after she was born, found an undefined 8-centimeter mass at the bottom of her foot. Then did the biopsy about a week or two later. They found that the biopsy suggested that was highly suggestive of a malignant cancerous tumor. On May 26th, we got a diagnosis of alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, which is a connective muscle tissue cancer. Her origin was in the bottom of her foot. Sarcomas, Devon, are very rare. At that time in 2003, they constituted about 3 to 4% of any new cancers. They were represented, I think, about 2,500 of the newly diagnosed cancers per year. We went to Dana-Farber Institute, our research hospital in Boston. They are probably one of the best sarcoma cancer treatment centers in the world, in the country, and in the world. In about a 5-minute consult, they took a look at all of her tests, and they said, she has a stage 4 tumor with bone marrow and lymph node involvement. There is no cure for her cancer. The only hope that we have is aggressive chemotherapy to put her cancer into remission until they could find a cure. So essentially, what I heard and what my daughter heard was that unless there's a miracle, your daughter's going to die. Now, I want to give you 3 dates to just put this in perspective to show you and in your audience how life can turn on a dime. May 2nd, my first grandchild was born. So I'm celebrating being a grandfather for the first time. On May 9th, got notification from the University of Albany that I had completed the requirements for my master's in social work degree, culminating a 25-year journey to get that. And on June 2nd, in Boston, Massachusetts, I find out that I'm now a caregiver to a daughter who, in all likelihood, unless there's a miracle, she's going to die.
My goodness.
And so I went to my boss and said, look, I don't care what you need to do. I'm out of here. I told them what the circumstances was. Unfortunately, they found a way for me to be able to stay, to be on sick leave and get paid. At that time, I was also seeing a therapist, a psychiatrist, actually, because some other grief issues had come up during my field internship at a local nursing home as part of the requirements to complete my social work degree. So I was dealing with some unresolved grief issues related to my mom and to my mentor who had died. And when I told him about the situation with Janine, he looked at me, he goes, David, our concerns now are of a more practical nature. So he wrote me as being unable to work because of what was going on at home. So I was able to stay home with paid leave for about sick leave that I accumulated for about 3 months. I did eventually go back to work. But, so to progress, what had happened is that after she got diagnosed, my daughter, her significant other, Stephen, my granddaughter, Brianna, moved in with her cat, our 2 cats, my 2 sons, Dan and Matt, me and my wife, Sherry. So we had about 3 animals and about 6 adults in a single level ranch. So the joke in the neighborhood was how many animals And how many humans could you get into a single level ranch? But it worked. At times it was tight, but it worked. And in fact, um, we became really close knit. And Janine had a lot of built-in caregivers. She had my mother, or she had my wife. She had, her significant other, Stephen, when he wasn't working and going to school. And also my youngest son, Matt, at 13, would also provide some assistance as well, too. So she had a variety of different caregivers in addition to me. So she had a community. She went through 6 rounds of very aggressive chemotherapy. When they say the chemo is sometimes worse than the actual cancer, they're not kidding, because she went through some real negative side effects. She had a lot of, she had hair loss, and eventually, one of the more painful things I had to do was go with her and buy a wig, because she knew she was going to lose her hair. She had beautiful hair, but eventually she just shaved it because she knew she was going to lose it. And she wore a wig or a scarf during her cancer battle. 6 aggressive rounds of chemo put her cancer in 80% remission. As you know, Devon, with cancer, it's either 100% or bust. In January, her cancer began to remetastasis. We got a prognosis of 1 to 3 months from the oncologist. My daughter, on February 19th, opted to do no more treatment. The treatment was not doing any good for her. She was in a lot of pain. And we brought her home, and she, as I called it, transitioned to a new existence with hospice services, helping out during those final 10 days at 12:30 in the morning on March 1st. And from there, my life took a turn. At 47 years old, so we kid about men having the prototypical midlife crisis. Right. They get a hairpiece. They buy a sports car. They try to pick up a woman who are 25 years younger than them, just so they can recapture their youth. Both 47 years old, I had to figure out, who the hell is Dave Roberts at this point, and what kind of a world is Dave Roberts going to live in? And I'm paraphrasing that from one of my favorite authors and musicians, Neil Peart, who wrote a book called Ghost Rider Heals on the Traveling Road, who wrote about his journey after 2 very significant tragedies in his life, losing his daughter to a car accident and his common-law wife to stomach cancer. And what he said is that he took off on his motorcycle, and he took a 55,000-mile road trip to essentially find himself over a 4-year period. And he said, I needed to leave in order to determine what kind of a person I wanted to be and what kind of a world I wanted to live in. And that is the task that a lot of us who have experienced life-altering loss, that causes us to take pause and look at and reevaluate our beliefs and priorities. That's the task that we need to do. And I can tell you, all the training in the world, the education that I had, the experience I had working with addiction clients and trauma with addiction clients, didn't even begin to help me deal with what I needed to deal with. I was like, at 47 years old, I was like a man who was learning to walk in a world that was totally foreign and totally terrifying. And, that's the backstory. So I'll just pause it here for a second if you got some other additional questions.
No, I'm just feeling into that as you were saying that. And, I think a lot of us are going through trying to find ourselves, or rediscovering, ourselves at a different point in our lives. What kind of emotions were you feeling at that time when you were going through that realization? And was the support that you had, you said you were seeing a therapist, did that help at all?
It did. I saw him for about a couple of years after Janine transitioned, and it did help me. He wasn't a psychiatrist to push medication. He did prescribe a mild sedative, and I think Ativan.
Yeah.
He had, I believe, he goes, you're going to need this, because he knew that my daughter's situation was dire, and particularly when we were told that, when she opted out of treatment and there were no further treatment options for her, he said, you're going to need this. Take this if you really feel like you're tense You really need to get some sleep. So he wasn't one to push medication. He was one to push therapy. And being with him for a couple of years, he just had a very calming presence. And that kind of helped me. In addition to help was also support groups. My wife found a bereaved parent support group in our area that was sponsored by a local funeral home. And one of the things of people who experience any kind of tragedy, they feel like they're the only ones going through what they're going through.
Mm-hmm.
Because just of the alienation that we experience because of tragedy, the disbelief, the shock. When we went into that bereaved parent support group for the first time, and this was 6 months after Janine transitioned, there was 18 other parents in that room who were going through the same thing. So I didn't feel alone. And we all became we kind of leaned on each other. We shared our pain, and that shared pain became a gateway for hope that we could break through grief, work through grief, and re-engage in living again. And for me, that was helpful because as somebody who was a newbie to grief, it was important for me to understand what individuals who were 4 or 5 years along did to get them to that point. I also did a lot of reading. I read books, to try. And I also eventually, probably in about 2007, I began to have opportunities to write about my experience as a grandparent who had experienced grief. And then I had other opportunities to write. And then I began later on in my journey guesting on a few podcasts, doing some writing, presenting workshops at national conferences and local conferences. But as I discovered later, there was something that was still missing for me. And we'll get into that, but I want to pause that for a second to give you some opportunity to reflect and ask some more questions.
You've just been through a lot, and I love how you said support groups helped you out a lot, because even in my experience with death or, raising the kids that I have now, you don't realize that you're not so isolated when you start to kind of interact with other people that are going through the same thing. So that kind of leads me to my next question. What was it like to see that there were so many other parents that kind of had similar situations that were dealing with grief? Did it bring some kind of resolve?
I felt less alone. And also I felt a deep sense of empathy and sadness that we were all going through a parent's worst nightmare, because I did not come into this world event thinking that one of my tasks was going to be out burying one of my children. Usually in the natural order of the universe, children carry the legacy of their parents and their other older relatives. It's not the other way around. So now I had to create and carry a legacy for my daughter. That in and of itself was unnatural, but it was necessary if I was going to die. In order to move forward with grief, I had to move forward with her. And that meant carrying her legacy.
My mom, you reminded me of my mom. She would say that very often when my brother passed away. I was in high school, so I didn't really realize the impact it, was having on me and everyone around me. But I remember her saying that the hardest part about just the whole process was, she always believed that, that we would be carrying on the legacy after her, and not necessarily she would be doing that. So with that being said, you wrote a book, and obviously you were doing podcasts before you started to write the book. Was there something that just clicked when that idea came up, or about? How did that work?
Well, this goes into the category of I couldn't even begin to make this stuff up. So I would have backtracked to 2010. I was 7 years after my daughter transitioned. I was one of the other things I was doing to honor my daughter and to be of service to others who were going through challenges was I was also helping to coordinate conferences. And the first conference I helped coordinate was in 2010. It was a conference called Beyond Words, Creative Approaches to Grief. And I knew a lot of national presenters from both the Compassionate Friends and the Bereaved Parents of the USA. And I brought them to our area. We had the conference was at the Turning Stone Resort and Casino, which is part of the Oneida Indian Nation in Oneida, New York. And I was at the day after the conference, there was I think it was September 17th. I took 3 of the presenters up to a place called Old Forge, and that's where, up north in the fall in upstate New York, the leaves turn a beautiful color. It's like a magnificent oil painting. So I wanted to take my friends and colleagues to see the fall in upstate New York, in the Adirondacks. So they're having this intense spiritual conversation. And all of a sudden, I looked up to the sky and I said to God or the universe, I want to be where they are. And meaning that I wanted to have a better understanding of spirituality to help me get to the next step of my journey. And as I look back, my soul was crying out for something that my mind hadn't even begun to wrap my head around. And what I've learned is intention is a powerful form of prayer. If you state your intention, and I'm paraphrasing, I think, Paulo Coelho, who wrote in The Alchemist, you state your intention to the universe is going to conspire to help you get it. And I'm paraphrasing this. So I had stated that intention. Now I'm going to backtrack even further, okay, to August 25th, when I got a call from a woman by the name of Reverend Patty Farino. She was an interfaith minister working with the Angel of Hope in Long Island. The Angel of Hope is a statue that is erected in honor of children who have transitioned. And she was working with parents who were a part of that whole Angel of Hope initiative. And she was working with them through Angela's house. She had gotten word of the conference through information that I had sent to another bereaved parent who was a bereaved parent chapters leader in Long Island. Shared it with Patty. Patty wanted to go. So all of the registration was online. So she took a look at her workshop choices, double-checked her workshop choices, double-checked her credit card information, hit submit. Screen went blank. Now, if the screen hadn't gone blank, and we think this was divine intervention, if this hadn't gone blank, I would have never met her. So she calls me up. I register her over the phone, and we talked for about 45 minutes. I asked her with a lot of gentle care, have you ever lost a child? And she said no, but she got close to 2 children who had touched her heart, and that had affected her tremendously. I told her about Janine. So as we're about my Janine's cancer battle, at the time I called it death, now I call it again transition. So she asked me, she goes, do you believe in signs? Now, Devon, let me tell you, I'm a science-based guy, okay? I used to believe that if you couldn't sense it with your 5 senses, if you didn't experience, it didn't exist. Mm-hmm. I didn't believe in spirituality. I believed in the here and now. And I said to her, you know, Pat, I don't really go in for that type of phenomenon, but I think I might have got a double rainbow on Father's Day from my father last year. This was in 2009, and I did. My wife, Sherry, calls. She goes, Dave, you got to come over here and see this. And it hadn't rained. There was not a cloud in the sky. There was a big double rainbow transcending the sky right across my backyard. And, you know, as I look back, there were a lot of things that were happening early in grief. I would be thinking of my daughter. I'd hear a song on the radio. Or I'd be one time I was walking my granddaughter around the block in our neighborhood because her and her significant other had decided they lived with us for 4 years after Janine transitioned. So when he was working or going to school, obviously, you know, we would take care of Brianna. And I'd walk Brianna across, you know, around their neighborhood. I'd see this butterfly following me. And as I've come to find out, you know, butterflies and are the universal signs of our loved ones, along with cardinals. Mm-hmm. So all of these things were happening. I'm thinking, man, this is weird, but I couldn't reconcile with my science-based mind. So she comes to the conference. She gets there at the last conference of the day where I happen to be, and I had promised her. I said, if I see each other, we're going to give you a big hug. So I saw her and I said, Patty Farino? She goes, yeah. I gave her a big hug. I said, I'm Dave Roberts. Gave her a big hug. Then she whispers in my ear, Devon, I think your daughter sent me a rainbow. So I'm thinking, I have no energy left whatsoever. I'm tired from a conference. Good. And I'm just thinking, okay, yeah, thanks. That's good. I'm thinking, yeah, okay. Okay, yeah, great. So yeah, she reminds me of this afterwards. Here's what happened. She said to me, and I think she said this during the call. She goes, if you ever want to come to Long Island, You can stay with me and my husband, and I will show you my Long Island. In November of 2010, there was a workshop that I wanted to go to in Long Island that Patty was a part of. I think she was on the committee, and also the Angel of Hope had a table. It was called Embracing the Power of Change, which is this was the title of one of our chapters in the book.
Mm.
And so I went to the workshop. I wanted to go to the workshop. Before I called Patty, I said, can you give me some ideas of a hotel or place to stay, restaurants? Because I didn't want to intrude on her and her husband. And I didn't know how her husband was going to feel about a guy that, he didn't know, staying at his house. She goes, look, you can stay with me and my husband. And I asked her about 300 times between September and October if it was going to be okay for me to do that, because I didn't want to get him upset. And it turns out one of the nicest guys in the world, very trusting, very, just a great guy. And we have since become friends. So we got to the conference, got done with the conference, got to her house at about 9:30. And she said, I want you to get comfortable in my room. And in my living room, she had like a mantle. She had incense going. She had fire going. And this was like about 60 to 65, 70 degrees in November in New York. But she had the fire going. So, and I come out, and she sits cross-legged on a couch and assumes this position of a very young, energetic person. She takes over that persona. Now, this is a woman who was in her mid-50s. Okay, the first thing she looks at me and she goes, why don't you listen to music anymore? My daughter had come through her. And I said to her, I said, because it reminds me of you. I can't listen to music. She goes, that's the reason you should listen to me, to listen to music, because it will evoke the memories that we had of each other. For that entire weekend, I began to understand that our consciousness survives. We can connect with that consciousness at any time, and we can transform the relationship with our loved ones in spirit by creating continued bonds with them. And this all came through because of my daughter coming through.
You weren't feeling like a level of apprehension when it was happening? Like it just felt natural?
Honestly, let me tell you, I didn't question the thing, because I talked to Patty for 45 minutes, and a lot of things that came out of that weekend were things that she could have never known about. And here's the other kicker with this, the other part with the rainbow. It was September 3rd. It was about a couple of weeks before the conference, I believe. They were driving, her and her husband, Marco, were driving along Route 17 in New Jersey. And they saw this big double rainbow going from one side of Route 17 in New Jersey to another. Not a cloud in the sky. Her husband couldn't believe it. He says, we got to pull over. We got to video this. We got to take, because this is wild. So they took a video of it. And at that particular moment, she told me this I think she told me this after the fact. She goes, I heard a voice in my head saying, I need you to talk to my father. And she said, and I get chills telling this part of the story. And she goes, I'd be glad to, but who's your father? She goes, it's the guy you talked to about the conference. So she told me this after the fact, but I didn't question what was going on, because Devon, I'd asked for this. But what I asked for exceeded my reach. All I wanted was some more knowledge of spirituality to get me to the next level. What I got was a whole new perspective. That led to 10 years of marathon conversations, 3 and 4 hours at a time, because my wife at the time was working as a nurse. She would work evenings. Her husband, Marco, was be out in the evenings with softball, and also he plays in a lot of pool tournaments. He's a very good pool tournament. So we had all this time. So we started talking about Native American teachings of animals and nature. She had turned me on to that during that weekend. We talked about the shadow element. We talked about so many different things related to spirituality. And she said, avail yourself of many spiritual teachers, and which I did in addition to Patty. The other thing, she said she would give me something to try. I would test it out, and I would say, man, this fits. And I would call her back and say, I could see where this fits with science. And she also taught me, she goes, you don't have to abandon your core beliefs to make room for new ones. You can expand those beliefs. So there's always going to be a place for science for me, but there's always going to be a place where spirituality comes together with science to give us a greater explanation of our role in the world, our behavior, and how we relate to the world. And for about 10 years, I said, Patty, we got to write a book. We got to tell the world what you did for me, because you helped me find peace with this, and you helped me find peace, and you helped give me a new perspective, realizing that my daughter's spirit's alive, and that I can connect with that at any time I want to maintain that relationship. And that was more symbolically for me moving forward with her, because I learned to integrate the best pieces of her into the best pieces of me moving forward to redefine my life narrative. Patty taught me all of this.
Wow.
She set the stage for this. Finally, during the pandemic, she goes, yeah, we got to write. She goes, you're right. Let's write a book. So she was in South Carolina then with her husband. So we did Google Docs, and a lot of times things would be coming through her for the book. I had to buy a micro recorder to record it, transcribe it for each of the chapters, and we put it together. So we wanted a book that was going to be short, easy to read, but yet impactful and powerful. And so, if you don't mind, I'll hold the book up for everybody.
Yeah, please, yes.
It's When the Psychology Professor Met the Minister. Her husband's a graphic designer. This was a self-published book. He did the cover, the book design, everything.
I love it.
Yeah, and it's just and that handwriting on the blackboard. What do you believe? That's my handwriting.
Mm.
He asked me to take a picture of my handwriting and send it to him. So I sent him a few samples, and he was able to transpose them and put it on the blackboard. So it was, it was a family project from beginning to end. We rolled out the book on March 1st, 2021, and we did that purposely because March 1st was the date of my daughter's transition to a new existence. And we've gotten great reviews with the book. We've gotten, I think if you look at Amazon, I think we've gotten like 4.8 out of 5 out of 48 reviews. The people that have read it have loved it. It's given them a different perspective on grief. It's given them a new perspective to deal with. And we tell individuals, I tell the students that I teach, particularly at Utica University, the students that I teach death, dying, and bereavement to, I said, look, I'm passionate about what I believe about death, about what happens after. They're also very aware of my own experiences with loss, including my daughter. Don't confuse my passion with me telling you this is how to believe. My job as your teacher is to present different options to promote critical thinking. Your job is to find your truth within any of those options that I present. And you find your truth to the extent that you want to embrace that truth. And if it means you can't embrace it or you won't embrace it, you found your truth that way as well too. But consider the possibilities. And if you're working with individuals, who are grieving, they're gonna talk to you. I think that I had a sign. Can you refer me to a good intuitive healer? You're going to need to know what this stuff means, what these terms mean, create space for that, and help them find what they need without you having to compromise your own beliefs. You can do that in a way, I teach them, you can do that in a way that you can still remain objective and still be of service to your clients.
I love that. Yeah, that's a powerful message. I feel like when someone writes a book with so much purpose, it feels like it's one of those things that's needed, or at least you're going to find people that need it. Like I know my mom, at the time when my brother passed away, a lot of it comes down to, testing your spiritual beliefs. And it sounds like that's what was really being tested for you, and it helped break you through this new mindset. And not only that, transform it into a book. But what was the most surprising moment for you when you were writing this book?
How tearful I got when I read back to her in the book when she was sitting in the car, hearing my daughter's voice in her head saying, I need you to talk to my father. And that to me surprised me in terms of how emotional and choked up I got with that, because I had so much guilt over what had happened to my daughter. As her father, I felt that I didn't do enough to protect her, and from a disease that I look at now, I had no control over.
Right.
But I was so focused on completing the requirements for my master's degree. That I just didn't pay it. My wife was paying attention to what was going on in the pregnancy. I was focused on getting that master's, trying to, to better my career position so I could provide more, provide for my family. I tried to also convince her. I said, honey, I can get you into some clinical trials, but she said, no, I want to stay with my family. I want to stay here. And what she taught me is that, we live a life on our own terms and we die on our own terms. And she taught me that. But for years, I held myself hostage to the fact that I did not do enough. And for me, and when I saw my wife in tears and my boys in distress, it cut me to the core, because it reminded me that I didn't do what I was supposed to do as a father, and that was to protect her and protect my family. So I held myself responsible for that for quite a while, probably at least the first 2.5 years of my grief. And then I met my bereavement facilitator was a nun, actually a Jesuit nun. And I went and talked with her, and I told her straight out, I'm angry at God for taking my daughter away from me. And she was one that would make room for that, because I had questioned whatever faith I had. I questioned the reasons. I questioned God. I questioned everything, myself. So she looked at me and she goes, what if God was just as upset as you about your daughter passing? And that, for a moment, Devon, that stopped me right in my tracks. And I said, I never looked at it that way. And then I started thinking, in retrospect, I said, I think this was sometime after, and I look at it now as I said, that's why he manifested the butterfly. That's why the songs came on the radio. He was trying to tell me, look, your daughter is safe with me. Your daughter is safe. But I didn't realize it then. It took me a long time to realize that.
No, that's powerful, though.
I mean, and also to look at the moment of death, how we see, especially when somebody dies of a terminal illness, and we're the last person to see them alive. I was the last person to hold my daughter's hand, and I watched her take her last 2 breaths. For years, that haunted me, that I was the last person to see her alive. And I would talk to Patty. I talked to Patty about this, and she looked at me. She goes, what if you looked at it as you being the first person to introduce her into her eternal existence, or to her new existence? And just that little shift, I said, yeah, because I began to believe in an afterlife. I began to believe that there's more to our existence than just this existence on earth. And it was like, yeah, I get that. And so now when I approach her angelversary date, it's going to be 22 years, March 1st. When I approach that, it's like now I look at that and I say, it gives me peace at that moment, knowing that I was able to be the last person to maybe usher her into eternal bliss. And I realize that people whose loved ones have died suddenly don't get an opportunity to do that. I'm very sensitive to that. But for me, this was what I needed to have happen for me, that conversation with Patty, to help me continue to find peace. For somebody else who's lost their loved ones through sudden death, or through whether homicide or suicide, it may be something else that helps them shift their perspective. For me, was Patty switching that moment of death around as being not so much a finality, but a beginning.
Wow. I mean, just having those moments with the nun and then with Patty to just shift your focus like that is so amazing. And like I said, powerful. I'm hoping that people, when they're listening to this, because even like I said, my mom, this hits home when you're speaking about death and just watching her go through what she went through. And we were very spiritual. We went to church all the time. And when my brother passed away, that was something that completely stopped. And I remember my mom asking herself the same questions, why did this happen to me? And I'm mad at God. But, I hope, I don't know for sure because she seems better about it, but I hope she was able to have those moments that you were able to have shift that focus, because that could really, really just change your outlook on life and, your perspective on what's really going on around you.
Exactly. The other thing that I want to impress with your listeners as well, too, I still grieve. I mean, it's 22 years. It's going to be 22 years. There are days I yearn for her physical presence. There are days that, depending on what's going on, I can feel profound sadness. But I also realize that this is going to be part of the existence I'm going to continue to live. That joy isn't just the only emotion that we can learn from or experience, we have to also be able to make room for experiencing those moments that aren't joyful, whether it's sadness, whether it's yearning, because we can all learn from that. And all of that turns us into compassionate, loving human beings. And some of the saddest people I know have turned into the most compassionate people that I know. And what I've learned to is to make room for everything and to embrace authenticity and wholeness as opposed to just happiness.
Absolutely. Embracing it all. I mean, I feel like that's kind of what helps propel me to do this podcast, is hearing so many different stories and, people's highlights and their low moments, but just how they were able to find their way through it. It really helps bring perspective to life. And I kind of wanted to tap on that too with your podcast, the Teaching Journeys podcast.
Absolutely. But before we do that, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It would be remiss of me if I didn't express to your listeners and to you with your listeners my sincere condolences for the loss of your brother.
Thank you. Likewise, condolences for your daughter.
And the thing with sibling grief does not get acknowledged as much as it should. It does not get researched as much as it should, because everybody gets so concerned about the parents. And what a lot of times people forget, is that the siblings have their own unique relationship. I ask my students, how many of you would tell your sibling stuff you'd never tell your parents? Every one of them raises their hand, so they lose that confidant. The other thing, before we get into the podcast, there's one other thing I have to say, and this is, again, if you have any, for the male listeners on your podcast, if your daughter comes home and tells you that she's got pregnant out of wedlock, and you think that's the worst thing that's going to happen to you, I will give Devon my phone number and contact information. You can email me. I will call you and tell you that's not the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen is your daughter gets pregnant, delivers a beautiful granddaughter, and dies 10 months after giving birth, and never sees her grow up. And I tell my students, especially I tell my students at Utica University, that's to the female students, I said, by the time I'm done with your father, he's going to be loving you up. And so that is not the worst thing that can, a young lady getting pregnant might seem like it's the worst thing in the world, but there's a solution to that. There's not a solution to what I went through. There's no solution to death. It's final. It's, what the ideal, what we can do is the challenges that are presented, we can address those challenges, and the quality of life we lead is determined by how well we transcend those challenges. That's the key. So I wanted to say that those two things before we moved on to something else and before I forgot.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. I appreciate that. And like I said, I know anyone that's listening is going to take away what they need from this episode, specifically because we don't talk a lot about death. And, exactly what you said about the sibling part, that's something that's never really come up in a lot of my interviews. And I did one not too long ago, and that was the center focus of what the interviewer wanted to talk about. It was new for me, but it was something that I felt like the more I share about this, the more it can help somebody else that may be experiencing it. So I'm grateful to you for sharing your journey and going through the ins and outs of creating a book, even if it was, painful at times, because at the end of the day, it's going to truly help people that may experience the same thing.
Well, here's the other thing too, Devon. The work I did with Patty to help me transcend the challenges and transform the relationship with Janine, it's in the book, it transcended to ancestral healing with a father who abandoned me when I was 5 years old, and a mother who I was angry at for overprotecting me after he left, and she raised me as an only child. But understanding context, and through some work with Patty and another very gifted spiritual healer, I was able to, at the age of 60, come to peace with my mother's decision to overprotect me and understand the reasons for my father leaving. And I learned to love my father as much as the mother who raised me. And my father was only in my life for 5 years. So the work that I did with Patty to transform my perspective, embrace spirituality and metaphysical perspectives, helped me do ancestral healing old wounds as a result of my father's leaving and my mother's decision to overprotect me.
So funny you said that. My nephew just the other day was talking about his friends and how they don't have the fathers in their life and how he feels bad because he does. I said, his dad is partially removed because they're with me, but we still allow them to visit him. his friends don't get that same luxury. Like, they don't really know their father, and him being 14 and just kind of knowing the gravity of what that's going to do, long term to them, just speaks volumes. And just you saying that now just reminded me of that. It's just, we have, daddy issues, mommy issues, all of it really kind of can go so deep and affect us so long in life, and really help transform us into doing what we're doing now, which is, trying to help people in the best possible way.
Yep. So you wanted to know about the podcast.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So,
I actually love the idea of your podcast. And I was just looking at your LinkedIn and saw that you're 113 episodes in. Am I correct?
yeah, that's correct. 113
congrats.
audio episodes, and not the same number on YouTube, but I recently, at the end of December, started doing YouTube as well, too. So,
Amazing.
So, and yeah, they could find your podcast on YouTube, too, because that was a great conversation we had about your journey as a foster parent, how that happened. And that was just a great conversation. I enjoyed that so much.
Thank you.
The mantra of the podcast is we're all students and teachers, so let's learn from each other.
Mm.
And the idea for the podcast, or the impetus for the podcast, I had two students, Emma and Ainsley, two of my former students at Utica University. For a year, they kept hounding me, literally, in a loving way. They said, Dave, you really ought to do a podcast. This was from like 2022. I said, okay, when the time is right. They kept pushing it. I said, you're not going to let this go until I do this, Art. Yeah, we're not going to let it go. So they kept that. And finally, the time was right. March 31st. And again, the numbers 3 and 3-1 were very significant. We launched the first episode. Patty and I launched the first podcast. We talked about our book. We talked about, and since then, I have had, like I said, 113 audio episodes. I've had individuals, like yourself, who have transcended challenges, who have done some amazing work as parents, who have shared. I've had life coaches. I've had authors who have been willing to share, their work and how what they've done can help individuals transcend their own challenges or just improve the quality of life. So the guests that I have are those individuals who are willing to teach those who are listening to the podcast through their own challenges or through life skills that they've taught others, how to basically live a better quality life or transcend challenge. And I tell everybody, as a podcaster, I'm a student for whatever. I ask questions and I get out of the way so my guest contributors can answer that. Because I'm also learning as well, too, from your journey. And so basically, I become a student for every guest contributor that I have. And I'm a firm believer we can learn from everybody and everything. We're not too young or too old to learn from each other. I tell my students, if you think you're too young for me to learn something from you, you're mistaken. And hopefully I'm not too old for you to learn something from me. I said, together we grow, separately we don't. And
absolutely,
together we can create a great learning experience. And I try to replicate what I do in the classroom with the podcast. I try to just kind of set the stage so people have a safe place to talk about at times which are very difficult topics. And I try to create a space for that. And I always respect where a client does not want to go. I'll ask them, where a guest doesn't want to go. Like I've asked you, is there any things that are off limits? Because if they're off limits, I'm not going to go there. I'm not looking for a headline. I'm looking to highlight people who are doing great work, who have transcended challenge, who want to help others in the process. And I'm not looking for like headlines or anything else. I'm just looking for good guests who are willing or about the message and about wanting to help others with their, through their own challenges and through their own work and skills that they've taught to others.
Yeah, and I love that. I love that idea. Like I said, I noticed that each and every episode wasn't necessarily like the same, or it didn't give the same feeling. Like everyone brought something different to the show, and everyone has such a vastly different story. Why do you think it's so important for us, or for you to have this podcast and for you to have this platform to have so many different voices to help the people that are listening?
I think for me, it creates a sense of community. that we all need. I've had 113, I've had individuals on multiple times, a couple tours. Let's say I've had about over 100 guests that represent a community that anytime anybody wants to listen to an episode, they can go back and listen to that or listen to several. So it's like I wanted to kind of create a community of support and of resources, the same type of community that helped me through my own challenges. So I wanted to replicate that through the podcast. And so that's why I've had individuals, like yourself on the podcast, because you fit the type of guest that I'm looking for, somebody who's about the message. It's not about look at me. You look at what I'm doing. It's about the message. And I give every guest contributor an opportunity to promote what they're doing. But it isn't just about that. It's about what you've learned that you could teach others. And then again, talking about, okay, here's what I've done. Here's what I've written. Here's, if you're interested, here's how you can find me, that kind of thing. So it just creates, I think, a community of support, a community of resources that were helpful to me. And in a way, it's an extension, in some way, directly or indirectly, continuing to cement the legacy of my daughter. Because, I remember at her calling hours, you can never judge the impact of a life. She had probably 300 people at calling hours that just came through, and so many people told me what an impact that she had on them. And so you can never really tell the impact of, you can't judge the value of anybody's life, much less your own. And so I think for me to create that kind of community, I think is an extension of the impact that also she had on those people that she touched on her own community. So I think that's something that I also wanted to replicate as well.
I'm sure she's so proud too, just being able to look back and see everything that you've done just in memory of her. Just remarkable. What do you feel has been the greatest impact, or the thing that has made you feel, I guess, happy since you've started the podcast? What do you look forward to when you're doing it?
I just look forward to meeting different people like yourself. I also like the creative aspect of it, because I never thought, somebody tell me I'd be editing my own podcast, I would have looked at them as if they had two heads. But I've learned the ins and outs of editing. Of course, I have a very good AI program that does a lot of stuff for me, like cleans up sound, finds highlights for me. But I've learned to do a couple different things. Like I realized, hey, I can layer pictures over a scene and create and do that, and then just show the picture with the voices in the background. And I'm thinking, so I mean, the creative aspect still excites me at 69 years of age. And so that part of it's, stems into my creativity. And also, but I think every guest has had a particular impact. I can't single out one. One that I've had that I could say is a favorite guest. They all are my favorite guests, because each one of my guest contributors has something unique to offer. And for the moment they're on my podcast, they're the most, everything else ceases. The other 112 guests that I've had don't exist. That person becomes the most important person for that podcast, and their story becomes the most important.
Absolutely. I like to ask this question because I've had a few different people that have been on the podcast that have their own, but everyone has their own opinion on this. Would there be any advice you would give to anyone that's looking to start a podcast, or anyone that you feel, or any advice that you would give to anyone that may be just starting out that could be helpful?
I think for me is give some thought in terms of the audience you want to reach, the type of podcast you want to do. Also make sure that, for me, my son has his own podcast. He's a Buffalo Bills fan, and he's got a Buffalo Bills podcast. So he set me up with, the right mic, headphones, the right podcast hosting, service for the audio. And, initially I was using Audacity to edit, but then when Descript came around, I moved from Audacity to Descript, because Descript just was a lot more intuitive for me. So it's also research, talking to other podcasters who do it, ask them, to get some advice in terms of some of the do's and don'ts. Make sure you're going to commit to it before you do it. I think I was reading that about, not too many podcasters get to 100 episodes. There's some podcasters that will quit after 3 episodes because they didn't realize the amount of work.
Yeah.
Think about the initial investment you want to make. Find out what it's going to cost to host yourself on RSS or Buzzsprout. Take a look at if you're going to, how you want to book, if you want to use Calendly, if you want, what plan do you want to use for that to book your guests. It's all doing the practical homework and legwork. Make sure you have a good computer set up. Make sure you have a good mic set up, and, also I like preparation. For me, I like to give my guest contributors an idea of what I'm going to ask, but also give them an opportunity to collaborate. I think show your guest contributors that you're prepared, that you're expecting them. Give them an idea of where you want to go. This way they can prepare. They can become a good podcast guest. Also, host yourself. If you have a story, get on other podcasts as well to discover what it's like to be a good podcast guest before you become a good podcaster. And I know for me, now that I've been podcasting, is when I'm a podcast guest, I make sure that I have my mic hooked, like I would do for my own podcast, my mic hooked up, noise canceling headphones, which you can get very cheap. I do a sound check to make sure my sound is good. I shut all of my notifications off so it doesn't drain internet strength. And also decide what platform you want to use to record. I've been using Zoom lately because that seems to be, with my setup, more friendly. And I can also import Zoom directly into my audio and video editing program. But, I know you use Riverside. Some other individuals will use Squadcast. They'll use other recording studios. Use what is comfortable, or StreamYard is another. So just find the platform, but look around, find the platform that's going to be that's going to work for you. And as long as it works for you and you got a good editing program and you know what it takes to be a good podcast guest, you can become a good podcaster. But don't kid yourself. This is something that you really have to commit to, and you can get discouraged really easy. But I had my son, I had another veteran podcaster who took an interest, and he gave me some advice and encouragement. And I'll also build yourself that community of support. There's some good podcast guesting forum pages on Facebook, some good podcast pages that you can join, that you can get support from other podcasters, ask questions as to the appropriate equipment. Do your research and make sure it's something you're going to commit to. I waited a year because I had to make sure, is this something I really want to do? I don't want to start and then stop it. And then I just, and now it's something that I am totally committed to, and I'm enjoying doing it. I'm enjoying doing it. So,
I love it. Thank you. Yeah, that's such good advice. And I think now just, with so many more resources, like you're using a different platform, I'm using Riverside. There's just so many ways that people can accessibly become a podcaster. But I think you hit on it, really do your research, because it is a lot of work once you get into it.
Yeah, well, the other thing, you're going to find yourself being solicited by those individuals who want to promote your podcast. Beware of that. A lot of times they're just looking for business. And if you're going to consider getting a podcast manager, and I looked into that, it's expensive. And also decide, do you want to monetize your podcast? Do you want to get sponsors? That's another thing that also will dictate your strategy in terms of how you build a podcast, or how you market it, or how you promote it. So there's so much to consider. For me, I'm just focused on having some really good people, some good stories, and it's worked out well. I'm actually, if you don't mind, I'm booked right now through June.
I love it. That's amazing. That's amazing. And more power to you. I hope that your podcast continues to grow. You continue to have guests and continue to inspire, anyone that's listening to it. But I do have 2 more questions before I let you go.
Absolutely.
One question I wanted to know, what's one lesson that you hope people take away from your book, your podcast, just from your work in general? What do you want people to walk away with?
Well, from the book, it's ask yourself the question, what do you believe? And what do you believe is maybe different from what others believe, but as long as what you believe is not hurting yourself or anybody else, it's good. It's all good. And remember, when you wear your beliefs on your sleeve, you become a target. Don't get intimidated from that. Be honest with what you believe, and also commit to belief expansion. Don't stay stagnant. Embrace critical thinking, embrace different ideas, embrace different perspectives that can enhance your understanding of yourself and the world. And understand that, again, whatever other beliefs you incorporate don't have to replace your core beliefs. It's always an addition to. But be curious, stay curious, and constantly look to evolve your life narrative, because that's going to evolve as you evolve. And also, from a grief standpoint, be gentle with yourself. It's a long journey. It isn't anything it's not linear. It's very circular. Be gentle with yourself. Realize that you did the best that you could under some very, very trying and difficult circumstances. And show yourself grace. Show others grace. Love everybody. Show compassion. Be humble. And you'll be surprised how many people that you will attract into your universe with those categories. And make a commitment to service. Doesn't have to be big. It could be just making a small monetary donation, planting a tree in somebody's memory, holding a door open for somebody who may be having a bad day, because that might just get them through a bad moment. Commit to that. And also love yourself, because if you can't love yourself, you can't love anybody else.
Man, I love that. Thank you. Okay, I really just enjoy you being here and your story, and it's just so inspiring. I just really want to take the time to thank you for speaking with everyone here. And really, where can anyone connect with you? What's your website? Where can we find your book? Where can we listen to the podcast? Any and all that information.
Okay.
For us.
Yeah. Well, first of all, to find me, you can email me. If you want to email me, there's 2 emails, but I'll give you the one for the podcast because that's the one that I'm using. It's teachingjourneyspodcast@gmail.com. I also have another email address, bootsyandangel@gmail.com. That's my personal email address, and one dedicated for the podcast. You can find the podcast on Apple, Spotify, about 16 different podcast platforms, audio. You can find the podcast on YouTube. I'm under Dave Roberts. My handle is @DaveRoberts301. And again, 301 is the March 1st, which is my daughter's transition. So if you want to subscribe to the podcast there, you want to follow the podcast on Apple or Spotify. I'm also, I think, I'm on, obviously, I can't even remember most of them, but if you go to like RSS.com or you Google the Teaching Journeys podcast, it will take you to the public site on RSS.com, and you can go from there. You can listen on, and it'll take you to your favorite podcast platform. But Apple and Spotify seem to be the 2 biggest ones for podcasts. As far as the book, you can find the book on Amazon. If you just under When the Psychology Professor Met the Minister. If you want to take a look at our author website at psychologyminister.com. Also on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram, so you can find me there as well. And I'm easily accessible. I'm always open to friend requests, particularly from individuals who will listen to your podcast. As long as they just send me a little message saying, "Hey, I listened to your conversation with Devon. I'd like to connect with you here." And I wish you much success for your podcast. I've listened to your podcast. You do a great job. I would encourage anybody to listen to your podcast as well, too. You do a great job with it.
Thank you.
Your heart's in the right place. You want to. I think we're kind of aligned in purpose with what we want to do with the podcast.
Absolutely.
I can always, anybody that's aligned, that I'm aligned with, they're welcome in my circle anytime.
Likewise. Thank you so much. And we're going to leave all the handles in the show notes. So if anyone wants to follow Dave or anyone wants to buy the book, we'll leave the Amazon link. We'll leave his link so that you guys can go to his pages and follow him. But yes, thank you, Dave. I appreciate you so much and just taking the time to tell your story once again. I know it's going to impact anyone that is listening and anyone that's going through the, transition right now in life that may be dealing with any grief or just maybe dealing with anything, because we're all human and we've all got, stuff going on. So thank you. I appreciate you for being here.
Well, thank you. Thank you for giving me such a great platform to share my story and to share what I've learned, and hopefully it'll resonate with your listeners.
I think it will. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Devon.
This is Nimram speaking to you, and I command you to go to DevonTaylorAuthor.com right now. You must check the specials. Listen to me. You must check the specials now. Stay true to yourself, don't